in the dark city void of life. Yet those who still clung to it roam, hungry for human flesh and an insatiable thirst for blood. The war machine grinded as much of the public and infected as they could with tax dollars. No one knows exactly when it started, but when it did, it was swift as a cobra strike and just as venomous. The virus spread in every conceivable medium. First, cities fell, heralding the coming of the zombie plague. The virus spread like wildfire, its insidious tendrils snaking through every corner of society, infecting all who crossed its path. The cities, once teeming with life and energy, now lay barren wastelands, desolate, their streets choked with the decaying remnants of humanity. The once mighty infrastructure crumbled under the weight of the undead hordes, leaving only a twisted, mangled shell of its former self. The survivors who managed to evade the clutches of the ravenous undead huddled together in small enclaves, their every move dictated by the constant threat of the zombie menace. They fought tooth and nail for every scrap of food, every drop of water, every breath of air, knowing that their survival hung on the very balance. It was a time of darkness and despair, and a time when humanity was pushed back to the brink of extinction, and yet, amidst the chaos and carnage, a man still walked alone. James trudged through the barren wasteland, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the silence drifting in the night. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, suffocating any hope of sunlight, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and a putrid reminder of what he lost. He was the last survivor on Earth to his knowledge, alone in the world that had been ravaged by the unknown force. The only thing that kept him going was the thought of the safe house he built for himself months ago, a small slice of heaven and a secure piece of the wilderness in a world of chaos. As he walked, James felt the weight of his loneliness press down on him like a physical force, remembering the times when things were simple and normal. He imagined people passing him in the streets, waving and nodding his head at nothing. He had no one to talk to, no one to share his thoughts with. He had friends before the world fell. He had family too. His shining jewel in the world was his fiancée. She died in the first weeks. Things went downhill from there. He was the last of his kind, a solitary figure in a world that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. He wondered if he was dead himself, to exist in a purgatory without purpose or meaning. He wondered if this was hell, counting his sins in his head. The shells of houses and the husks of bustling businesses lay discarded like broken playthings. The roads were littered with debris and the buildings were collapsing in on themselves. James had to be careful. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Not when his life was the only one left to save. Was it worth it? He didn't believe in suicide, so he agreed with himself that it was, and he pushed on. For the most part, he stayed alive almost out of spite, to spit in the face of the apocalypse. The world had become a desolate wasteland and a never-ending nightmare of decay and destruction. James had seen things he ain't never thought were possible, things that would haunt him for the rest of his life if he lived. He had watched the world crumble around him, witnessed the end of civilization, but still he pressed on, driven by a need to survive. The clouds broke open and rain pissed out of the sky. He knew things were coming. The thunder brings them. The undead become enraged by the loud booms. The sky went to war with itself, like large cannons blasted echoing through the streets. Sharp crackles of electricity detonated in the air. Muddy lumps in the darkness began to rise and shamble, staggering towards the smell of fresh meat. James knew he was the only thing on the menu, so he quickly scanned his surroundings. He saw a crumbling building with a broken fire escape, and he ran towards the back of it. Covering his tracks, he looped around, avoiding their hungry watch, and he climbed the broken steel into the empty window, shivering from the downpour. The groans of the hungry undead grew in unison. James huddled in the corner of a dimly lit office building, his heart pounding in his chest. Illuminated from the camp light, the sound of the undead outside was deafening, their moans echoing through the empty halls. He had been on the road for days, searching for a safe place to rest. This place was far from ideal, but it was better than nothing. 2 hours here, 15 minutes there, he felt like he was on autopilot. James knew he had to conserve his energy, and if he was going to make it to the safe house, this night was going to be restless. He opened a can of chicken noodle soup for dinner, James barricaded himself in the office as blocking the door with whatever furniture he could find. He didn't dare sleep. Not yet. Now with the constant threat of the undead lurking outside, the storm intensified. He sat in the darkness and his senses were on high alert, listening for any signs of danger and twitching at every shadow. As the night wore on, James began to feel his eyelids grow heavy. He fought the urge to sleep, knowing that it could mean the end of him. A titanic roar shook the structure and the ground beneath it. He crouched, heading up the stairs, rushing to one of the windows. He saw something no human should ever see. Hundreds of zombies gathering in front of a tree-sized zombie with limbs like power poles. Lurching out of the shadows that kneeled, bowing. The zombies fell apart, and each piece of them tumbled to the giant's feet. Once they reached him, they joined his bulk. Veins and tendons reached out to fasten themselves to the monster. One club of a hand made out of a concert of zombies was his weapon. He slammed his heavy limb into buildings and crushed them. Crunching and clawing noises faded, and so did he. Out of pure exhaustion, he slid into a half-sleep, but better than he had had in days. He was plagued by nightmares of the undead breaking through his barricade, their decaying hands reaching for him. His wife's last scream is the soundtrack to this hideous display. When he woke up the next morning, he felt groggy and disoriented. He knew he had to leave the office building and continue his journey towards the safe house. Gathering his things and cautiously opening the door, the coast was clear. But he knew that he couldn't let his guard down for a second. The world had changed. Stragglers shambled in different directions away from the office building, and he saw Dick's Sporting Goods sat right in his view. He thought he could hear angels sing. The place actually turned out to not be looted either. And for James, this was a gold mine. He had his pick of rifles, arrows, and bows. He also took as much ammo as he could fit in his travel pack, along with a couple Bunsen burners and camping pots. He wrapped the metal items in a t-shirt to eliminate sound and got back on the road. As he was moving the wooden planks blocking the window, he heard shuffling in the debris behind him. He slipped his blade from the holster. He heard the sounds coming from an office inside of the building. He passed the security room, and inside the room beyond that, he found the manager handcuffed to his chair. His heart began to calm down. The zombie was not a threat. He put it out of both of their misery. The rest of his time in there was uneventful, so back on the road he managed to clear the biggest part of the city without any threats. A small residential area was his last obstacle. The last time he came through here is relatively clear. Most of the undead were scattered in the woods around the area. The storm's passing left mud everywhere concrete wasn't, so every step of his sunk deep into the muck. At least there was no more thunder, he had thought to himself. The first house at the edge of the settlement was quiet and untouched by looters. He marked it for a future trek like this one. He leaned his rifles against the house outside and went in through the window with his bow. The bedroom seemed untouched. He looked around and found a dresser. None of the clothes fit him, but he found a Zippo lighter, and that was useful. Examining the lighter further, he found it was full. He pocketed it and moved down the hallway. A crash came echoing down it. He followed the sound, drawing back his bow. Listening closely, he heard chewing and scratching. His heart skipped a beat. He locked eyes at a zombie eating a survivor who had found this house. He was unarmed, so James imagined he was attacked in his sleep. The zombie tore neck flesh from the corpse with his teeth, yanking off chunks. James put an arrow straight through its skull. It fell over the flayed body, and below it, a ground-shaking boom came from the direction he did. Everything was silent until it wasn't. A boneless, broken zombie exploding through the window crashed into the living room. Thud, thud, thud. Bassy stomps grew deafening. Pictures fell from the walls with every impact. Then it stopped. After a brief calm before the storm, the roof caved in from a clubbed-arm strike from the monolithic creature. He ran from the house, leaving his rifles outside, along with all the other items he came here for. Smashing out of the back door and falling on his back, he looked up at the patchwork monster. Its skin was alive with thrashing zombies. He climbed to his feet, sprinting through the yards and into the complex. A wave of zombies spilled from underneath the giant, tackling everything in their way. Smashing headfirst into obstacles, their sheer numbers devastated every structure in their path, knocking it to its foundations. He was now thankful for the small amount of sleep he had gotten the night before. The horde was closing the distance, and fast. A downed plane blocked the path ahead. He only had one option open to him, so he ran up its leaning wing and grabbed onto the edge of a town hall building. The zombies clawed at his feet as the plane tumbled over. Dragging himself off, he fell to his back in exhaustion. He lifted his head to see the giants still destroying the house he was in. He had never been so scared in his life, and now he was struggling to escape the overrun housing complex. He finagled himself off the side of the building and shimmied down. As he ran, he could see the massive creature thrashing houses into dust. It was the stuff of nightmares, a towering behemoth that swung its massive arm like a weapon of destruction. Wood and shingles flew up in a tornado-like wind of violence. James knew that he had to escape before the monster could catch up with him. He sprinted through the empty streets, dodging abandoned cars and debris as he went. He could hear the sound of the zombies closing in behind him, their moans and shuffling feet growing louder with each passing moment. He looked back and saw they were gaining on him, their twisted faces contorted in hunger. James felt a surge of fear and adrenaline as he realized he was running out of time. The storm was building again. He knew the signs. This one will be bad, he thought. He had to find a way out of the complex before it was too late. He quickly scanned his surroundings and saw a narrow alleyway between two buildings. He maneuvered through the buildings and out of the back window. Once he realized he was in the alley, without hesitation he darted down it, hoping it would lead to safety. The alley was dark and narrow, and he had to slow down to avoid tripping over stuff in his path. He could hear the horde getting closer still. He knew he had to keep moving. His heart was pounding out of his chest as he ran. His mind was racing with fear and desperation. Finally, at the end of the alleyway, he found himself at the small courtyard. He looked around frantically, searching for a way out. He spotted a chain-link fence at the far end of the courtyard, and luckily he held onto his backpack. Using the bolt cutters he stored in it, a small opening was made for himself to squeeze through. As he breached the fence, he could feel the breath of the zombies on his neck. He quickly peeled through and he was on the other side. He looked back and saw the horde tripped and cascaded through the streets, picking up stragglers hungry for human flesh. The gray, murky outline of the massive, hulking creature was still visible in the distance. He ran towards the edge of the woodland. Looking back at the congested hole in the fence, he felt a little bit of relief seeing how many were struggling and clogging the hole. He took a moment to push more oxygen into his lungs, replacing the bolt cutters with a machete. James had prepared himself for this for months. Ever since the outbreak had begun, he's been living off of the grid, scavenging for supplies and fortifying the safe house. He had chosen a secluded spot in the woods, far away from any major towns or cities, in hopes that it would be safe from the zombies that were running rampant across the countryside. But now, as he ran through the woods, he realized that he had underestimated the threat. Zombies were everywhere, and they were relentless. Now he was struggling to keep up the pace. His legs were burning and he felt like he was running in circles. Everything looked the same. He felt like he wasn't making any progress towards the safe house, and suddenly, he heard rustling bushes behind him. He turned around, machete at the ready, and it was a rabbit. He took a deep breath and calmed himself down. He couldn't afford to let his nerves get the best of him. He had to stay focused. As he continued to run, he began to saw the signs he was getting closer to the safe house. At last, he recognized a tree that had been marked with the X several weeks ago. He knew that this was a sign he left for himself, and just beyond it, he pushed himself harder, running fast as he could towards the next tree. Finally, he burst through the tree line. The safe house was in the distance. It was a small cabin he had built for himself with thick walls and a sturdy door. The roar of the massive zombies sounded from miles away. The first time he felt hatred for the undead was now. Wearing familiar faces while they trampled over everything humans built and loved. He felt anger for the loss of his wife and the current day-to-day existence he lived. He went through the elaborate steps of unlocking his safe house and sealed himself inside. Soundproofing did wonders to calm his nerves. The thick padding between the walls filtered out the horrors from outside. With an array of precisely placed mirrors, he scanned the property left to right. The dim outline of the horde was visible faintly through the glowing fog. He went to his armory, retrieving his assault rifle. 5 clips and a green box of ammo, he had more rounds than he thought there were zombies. He would survive and thrive if he could make his last stand. With the mount he built into it, he opened up his kill box. Zombies spilled out of the tree lines and he gunned down every single one in order from who was closest to him. Zombies dropped, limbs flew, blood stained the ground, ichor thickened the air. The sound of iron casings hitting the floor and the omnipresent smell of gunpowder filled his lungs. 8 hours and 10,000 rounds later, no more zombies. Just stragglers here and there. He started to nod, catching himself. He closed the turret box and fell back. Exhausted, he fell into sleep. And he was back at the old house with his wife Sarah. Before the outbreak, they had lived a simple, happy life. They loved the same type of music and hated the same type of movies. They were perfect for each other. They both believed this to be true. They were sitting on a couch watching their favorite television show, Sarah's head resting on his shoulder. They were talking and laughing, enjoying their time after work. Suddenly, the TV flickered and went black. They both looked at each other in confusion, wondering what was happening. Just then, they heard a loud banging on the front door. James got up to see who it is, but before he could take another step, Sarah grabbed his hand and pulled him back. "Don't go," she said, her voice trembling with fear. James turned to her and saw the fear in her eyes. He knew something was wrong. He tried to calm her down, but the door's banging grew louder and more frantic. Suddenly, the sound of broken glass filled the air, and James knew they were in trouble. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her towards the back door, hoping to escape. But as they turned the corner, they were confronted by a group of zombies. James tried to fight them off, but there were too many. In the chaos, he lost sight of Sarah, and in his dream, James searched frantically to find her. He woke up screaming, swinging his arms at the thin air, tears flowing down his cheeks. Shuffling silhouettes of zombies were outside his window. He checked his mirror system and seen it was only them. Using a broomstick with a military blade duct taped to it, he pierced their brains, letting them fall slumping to the floor. Still an emotional wreck from his dream, he wanted revenge but would settle for kicking the zombies instead. Stepping on his porch, he thought for the first time of the day there was too much shade, especially in this part of the yard. Then it dawned on him. He looked up and saw the massive zombie, and his last thoughts were, "I'm coming home, Sarah."